Welcome to the Media Roundtable podcast. I'm Dan Granger, founder and CEO of Oxford Road. This is a Media Roundtable Classic edition today. Very, very excited about this conversation because we get to do a little bit more of the type of discussion that was why we started this podcast that we call the Media Roundtable. We really didn't create it simply to talk about the goings-on of the audio industry and its monetization, although that is very near and dear to our hearts, and every episode is dedicated to the Chief Audio Officer. There are big questions for all of us who work in media, whether you're on the commercial side of it or the production side of it, that I think we all have to wrestle with, and increasingly so in a very complicated and fast-changing world. What are the rules we have for journalists? What do we expect of them? What do we expect for content creators? And are the rules different if you're putting something on X or social media, or if you're doing a podcast, or if you're a TV broadcaster? What are the standards of journalism now that we're here in the 21st century, and how has that changed from the past? These are the things we're always dealing with, and I think the business term we use when we think about these things is typically things like brand safety and suitability. We talk about misinformation, but really we live in a very polarized world, and a world that has changed so much just technologically that we haven't really had a chance to catch up with all those changes and create infrastructure and best practices and expectations in an organized way. And so that's a lot of what we started this podcast really to do. And the first few years of it, we're all about those types of conversations. Why are we so divided, and what's media's role in that? And what can we do about it from the advertising community to be responsible in how we behave? So we're going to go back to some of that today. And I think the person that we have to unpack this with has really dedicated themselves to similar pursuits, both as a producer, but now through a new show that is specifically designed to be introspective from the view of a journalist. I'm talking about Brian Reed. Brian Reed, if you're unfamiliar with Brian, he is the host of hit podcasts like S-Town, the Trojan Horse Affair. He was a producer of a little podcast you may have heard of called This American Life. He is currently the host of a new show called Question Everything, and he is listed on a very short list of some of the best storytellers in the audio medium. So this is going to be a great conversation. And Brian, welcome to the Media Roundtable podcast. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Dan. That's really kind. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So during my long preamble there, it feels like you have started a show that is similar in purpose to why we started, but we did it from the commercial side of the business. And it seems like what you've done with Question Everything is really ask yourself, the same types of questions that we've been asking, but as a content creator. Can you just take us back to the building blocks here of what is Question Everything, and why did you decide to do this program?
Yeah, when I think about kind of how I came to making this latest project, I've been thinking about a quote I heard the movie director Bong Joon-ho say, but I believe he was quoting Martin Scorsese, if I'm not mistaken. And it was something to the effect of, the most personal is the most creative. The idea being that you have to, as a creative person, you have to be looking inward in order to find the thing you want to say, or the topic you want to delve into, or the story you want to tell that is going to touch people the most. Like the universal themes come from the specific. And in this case, even though I think our show is speaking to very big questions and themes that are on a lot of people's minds, it did come out of a very personal experience for me, just in my career. Pardon me. In 2018, about a year after my show S-Town came out, which was listened to by hundreds of millions of people, or 100 millions of downloads, millions of people, and got a lot of attention, and for a while, just seemed all hunky-dory. In 2018, I got sued for that show by a group of lawyers who I had no connection to. It was kind of a bizarre situation. they banded together and sued us under this new Alabama state law. Alabama was where the podcast took place. But what really struck me about the suit and kind of like haunted me about it in a way, or obsessed me about it, was the legal argument they were making was that my work was not journalism. They were arguing in a court of law that the show I'd made, the work I'd done, was not journalism legally, which put me in the position of having to argue to a court of law that it was, which is kind of a weird thing. Like, I don't know, Dan, if you picture, like, how would you argue to a judge that, you are legally doing the job you're doing?
Yeah,
Like,
that's a hard one.
I guess, like, there's a few things, like, if you're a lawyer or a doctor, sure, like, I passed the bar, or you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah. But where's the bar
I
for
took the
journalism?
Hippocratic oath, but
Right.
like, it's not the same for journalists, and it forced me to kind of really like sit with that fact in a way that I hadn't before. That
Hmm.
both the power of our profession and our role in society comes from the fact that really anybody with the wherewithal can pick up the pen and become a journalist. That's what's very, powerful about our medium, but it does open us up to confusion, and I think that's also happening now. Confusion and downsides, where people can bad actors or incompetent actors can claim to be journalists. And so that's kind of the world we're delving into on this show from all sorts of angles.
Can we unpack it a little further for folks that are unfamiliar with S Town?
Sure.
Can you give the quick backstory on what happened without giving away more spoilers than you're comfortable, and then so that we can talk about why that got called into question as
Yeah, I don't think you can spoil a
journalism?
7-year-old show, so I'll I'll
Fair
just go
enough.
for it. So S Town, it's a 7-part limited series podcast. It was, I think, one of the first ones, if not the first one, to release as a binge. Essentially, it was still
Oh, really?
that new back in 20. I remember being very excited about that. It was still kind of relatively early days of Netflix, like coming out with the binge model. Like House of Cards was still fresh. Um,
Hmm.
and I remember thinking, like, we're going to be one of the first ones to do this. It's going to be cool to see how that affects the storytelling. It was so, you might find another example, but it was certainly, I think, the biggest, highest profile one to do that at
Hmm.
that time. So yeah, 7 parts, and it's the story begins with how it began in my life. I was a producer on This American Life, and we got a email from a listener named John B. McLemore, and the subject line of the email was John B. McLemore lives in Shittown, Alabama. Um, and he was writing our show saying he was a longtime listener and he lived in a rural county in Alabama, Bibb County, um, just west of Birmingham. And he wanted us to come down and investigate a few incidents that he just saw as emblematic of the corruption and decay in his rural county, including a murder that he said a local rich kid had gotten away with. And I started looking into that. I eventually went and visited John in Alabama, investigated the murder, but also from the beginning, John was one of the most fascinating people I'd ever met. He lived in a house from the 1800s on like 150 acres in Bibb County. He lived alone with his aging mother who had dementia. He was in his late 40s. He had a giant hedge maze that he had designed in his backyard that you could see on Google Maps. He talked a mile a minute and could spout off, the Latin names of the plants in his yard. And he was an antique clock restorer by trade and could talk about the planets and the stars, and was both brilliant and darkly funny. And he was just someone that you kind of were drawn to like a moth to a flame. And ultimately, I learned that the murder he said had happened was not a murder, even though everyone in town believed it was. Like, I talked to many other people who believed that the murder had happened, but it turns out it was a fight, not a murder. No one had died.
Hmm.
Um, and shortly after I came to that realization, John killed himself on June 22nd, 2015. And at that point, um, I had these recordings with John. I basically had recordings kind of documenting the last year and a half of his life. And I'd gotten to know people who knew him in his community, and we stayed in touch shortly after his death. And I went to his funeral, and I realized there was a story here to tell about this man's life and his community and why he ended it. Kind of a remembrance, but a character study, an investigation that his was a life worth sharing with people. Even though he died alone in this tragic manner. And that's what S Town became. And it moved a lot of people. I think it spoke to a lot of people to hear about, this man's life. Um, and the lawsuit was basically alleging that we'd violated something called the Right of Publicity Act, which is a type of law that exists largely for celebrities to use so that their likeness cannot be used on commercial merchandise. It's not. It doesn't apply to journalism. It doesn't apply to movies. It doesn't apply to music. There's a famous case where Rosa Parks sued Outkast um, under the Right of Publicity Act because they named a song after her.
Right.
Everybody get to the back of the bus, and she lost. Even though she didn't like the song, she didn't like that her name was associated with this kind of what she saw as like a trashy rap song. But
Yeah.
under the First Amendment, you're allowed to do that. So anyway, that was their lawsuit. It was under this law that did not apply. But so in order to make a legal argument, they had to say that what we'd done was not journalism, that it was essentially an advertisement in total, the entire
Yeah.
podcast. So
Yeah. So question everything, I guess, to bookend it here. You really took the criticisms that were not just leveled against you in this lawsuit, but also by other journalists, and it kind of seems like you said, okay, well, let's explore, and you kind of in a way are putting yourself on trial for your own decisions to select that story and using that as a microcosm for how do we think about journalism today, which is really interesting. One of the things we say at the agency a lot is that feedback is the breakfast of champions, right?
Mhm.
And like being able to embrace your blind spots and the things people might observe about you that I think our natural inclinations are to defend, to clench up and to say, no, that's not true because, but to actually say, no, wait a minute, I'm actually going to take the thing you're throwing at me. I'm going to look at it. I'm going to see if it can help me and see if we can learn something and grow from this. And I think that's a value that that we hold dearly. And but I it's unusual that somebody would self-inflict that type of scrutiny, right? So you really have an appetite for it, it seems. But I appreciate the bravery of it. Can you
Thanks.
talk
I
about?
appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think can you share some of the things that were said to you outside of the lawsuit, just kind of attacking your decisions and your approach?
Yeah, there was a small but vocal kind of corner of criticism that basically was saying that the podcast was invasive into a private man's life. Um, that after he died, while he had been working on a story with me, he didn't know what the story would become, that it would become about his life and his death, and that there was something morally, as some people put it, indefensible about the project uh,
Mm-hmm.
for that reason. And so, honestly, it was something I really never got. Like, I didn't understand it. And I still don't agree with it. I believe the project is morally defensible, but I kind of always wrote it off as like clickbaity headlines. I think like people just kind of like, I don't know, when you start to put stuff out and it gets like a public reaction, you start to notice that like someone will write something and then the next person will like have to acknowledge it and be like, oh, the controversial podcast. I'm like, is it controversial? One person wrote a criticism, you know? Um, but so I kind of like wrote it off in that spirit, frankly, as it was happening. And yeah, I didn't see the moral conundrum in what we had done. It seemed, to my mind, what we'd made was very much in line with a long tradition of people writing nonfiction books about people who died, biographies, obituaries. It didn't seem, you know, that wasn't a challenge for us. There were lots of challenges that we faced and moral questions we faced in making the story, but the existence of the story in the first place wasn't one of them. And so anyway, so for this first episode of Question Everything, 7 years on, I decided let me finally talk to one of these people. Let me just see like what's behind this. And the woman I talked to is a career journalist in Australia who wrote that S Town was morally indefensible. And while it's not a mea culpa for S Town in any way, I do stand by it. And I think what comes out of the conversation, what came out of it for me in part was she really this is really a genuinely held reaction and belief. And it's interesting that both she and I could have been worked in this field for many years, and each kind of really feel this differently about this.
Hmm.
And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, personally, and that's from people who've listened to the episode, have said. But I do think I hope we give it equal weight so that people can hear it and weigh it for
Well,
themselves.
yeah, no, and so when you look at it, I wonder, there's some things that are like, no, we were exactly right to make the choice. We had to make an A or B choice, and that we selected A, and that was the right choice, and here's why. And then sometimes it's like, well, there's going to be collateral damage for anything that you do. And so, yes, that may have been you may not be regretful of the choice, but is there a deeper acknowledgement of any collateral damage, or is there any validity? Do you have to hold some of the counter arguments as also true while you are still confident that you
Mhm.
did something that was worth doing?
um
Is
so
there
I
a
mean,
necessary evil in the mix here,
so
so
the
to speak?
question is, there are different ways of framing how to look at this. This question that is at the heart of journalism, which is often journalism is about or centered on the pain of others,
Hmm.
and oftentimes some of the most traumatic moments of other people's lives. And that is the position we as journalists find ourselves in often as we're reporting. And so there is, you know, a challenge there in which asking somebody to recount in an interview, a very traumatic moment from their life, sharing that with the public, like there needs to be a reason to do that. And that's, in journalism, that's how we come up with kind of this assessment of the public interest in reporting something weighed against, what harm it might cause. And so you're always trying to minimize harm while serving the public interest. Like that's the kind of way I think about the moral question. Um, and it comes up every day in ways big and small as you're considering stories, as you're reporting stories, as you're considering moments in stories, whether to include them or not. It's macro, micro.
Hmm.
With S Town, I guess I like there's not a ton of direct collateral damage that I'm aware of, frankly. Like the people who um are close to the story largely appreciate it. That's what was
Hmm.
weird about this lawsuit. It wasn't someone who I knew who I had reported on who was upset, who
Wasn't the
felt the
kids the
fame.
person that was
No,
affected, and so there
they
wasn't
didn't
a lot of
know
real
John.
yeah.
Yeah. So it was this very kind of like detached legal argument. John's family opposed the people who were bringing the lawsuit.
Wow.
So it
Do
was
you
a
think?
bizarre
Yeah.
situation, as a journalist. It wasn't like, it'd be different if someone was suing me and I felt, I knew this person and they felt betrayed. It would be something different to reckon with than people who were just kind of coming and making a legal argument from the outside, or journalists who had no connection to the place also making an argument. So that was kind of always like, I did look, I was like, has someone been hurt here? And
Yeah.
haven't seen that.
You couldn't detect any harm. There's no evidence of
Yeah, I mean,
harm.
I think there's an argument that, the argument that someone like Gay Alcorn, the journalist I spoke to, is making is that there's a harm to legacy, perhaps, or, that there's certain obligations we have to the dead, which I'm not discounting. It's a more abstract harm, though.
Shit gets metaphysical fast, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, and I think that's what I learned from this process and making that first episode is it really comes down to how to deep feelings you have about and beliefs about death, about legacy.
Right. Right.
Um, and that's ultimately what we're talking about here. We're talking about, you know, is it a betrayal of someone who's died to um tell an intimate portrait of their life, or is it an honor? And I do
Yeah.
think you can see it both ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Life is complicated.
Mhm.
And so is death. And and I
Which I think
think
speaks to the richness of the reporting and show of the show, because the fact that it touched off such a deep debate, I think speaks to you know, the very important universal issues we were looking at, in
Well,
this.
and I,
Yeah.
yeah, and it speaks to the importance of question everything, I think is the point. And I love that out of the counter arguments you received, you said, I'm going to embrace this and I'm going to do something with it. By the way, have you ever seen anybody do that move before where they platform their detractors and then honor their arguments rather than just platform
Yes.
them to
Not before I did this, but in
okay.
making this episode,
Yeah.
um, one of my editors, Jonathan Goldstein, who hosts Heavyweight, and former This American Life producer and amazing radio creator, worked for the CBC for a long time. Um, he sent me an article that appeared in the Times some years back, where it was like it was on the page, but a conversation between uh Sarah Silverman, the comedian, and A.O. Scott. And I believe that A.O. Scott had criticized, he's a critic, the movie critic for the Times, or was. He'd written a pretty harsh criticism of something Sarah Silverman did, a movie she'd done, saying it
Mm-hmm.
was offensive some years
Mm-hmm.
back. And they
Mm-hmm.
got together and talked about it. And they talked about the impact that the criticism had on Sarah Silverman and her kind of own introspection that came from that, her criticism of the way he criticized her. It was interesting. But that's one of the few times I've seen it.
What if this
Yeah.
was the rule, right? Like, what if
Yeah.
this was journalism? Just the openness to the idea that there's usually two sides of a story, and we don't
Way
have
more
to
than two. Yeah.
dismiss. We
Yeah.
don't have to just dismiss the one that's
It's
not
more than
ours.
that. I feel like journalism does acknowledge that, and in fact, to its detriment sometimes, where it almost two dimensionalizes stories a lot of times.
Okay, let's
I
talk
think it
about
gives two
that.
sides, but I think having the sides actually like face each other, like and talk it out, that doesn't happen enough.
Well, go back to
You
what
know?
you were saying. So
Yeah.
we had Ben Smith on a couple of years ago, and we were talking about the evolution of journalistic expectations in this country. And what he was saying is like the 20th century, we had this strange anomaly, or maybe from the mid 1800s when print started going for reach and having to talk to two sides of an issue. So you didn't just want to have like the Boston Republican or whatever. Uh,
Right. There was a business imperative for quote unquote objectivity.
for
Yeah.
objectivity,
Because
right?
it was
So
a
that
wider,
drove the market.
net, a wider tent. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we get into things like fairness doctrine and this
Yeah.
this notion but what he was saying was that it was kind of an exceptional set of circumstances that we had this feature where journalism was supposed to give you two sides of an argument that had never existed before and arguably doesn't exist again. Are you saying that you think that the notion that we need two sides of a story is overrated?
No, I don't think it's overrated. I think it's been simplified.
Okay.
And then I think it's been ill-equipped to deal with the changing political circumstances in the
Mm-hmm.
world, in our country.
Mm-hmm.
It's been, I don't lay it all at journalists' feet. I think it's been abused by political actors, but I think there's been I'll put it as a lack of imagination among journalists about how we can move on from that approach while not losing what's important about it. And what's important about it to me is that a few things, like there's ideally, like when it's done correctly, it acknowledges a humility before the truth, that it's hard to know for real what's true in a lot of cases, not in every case. And in cases where you can know what's true, you should call it that way, regardless of what it means politically or who you're going to piss off. But in many cases, it's hard to know exactly. And so having it kind of acknowledges a humility that there's possibilities out here I mean maybe can't imagine, and
Right.
allowing for competing truth claims is how I would think of it, rather than just two sides. But like, if there's kind of a valid claim to the truth here, I should at least give it some space, you know?
Uh,
So that's what's important, is like the humility before the truth, and then
uh-huh.
fairness to people who you're reporting on, which is, if I'm going to say something unflattering about you based on my reporting, like I need to tell you about that first and give you a chance to offer me a reason why I'm wrong, beforehand. Um, and there's other reasons for it too, but those are the things that are important about that to me. It's not the like there are two sides. And I think, in fact, like that presentation, this is a whole nother kind of theory.
Yeah. No, but bring it
like
up.
I think we've been, and by we I mean the public in America, but also in journalists, like we've been trained in the last 30 years or so to think that the most important metric or spectrum on which to evaluate news is one of ideology or, partisan bias. And I don't think that's the most important spectrum to evaluate information or news on. I think it's probably the least important one. But because of like cable news and the way our media ecosystem works, we've all been trained to think that that's the most important thing. Like, as part of this project, or actually as part of my last project, and I've looked at it again, I went and reread the book I was given when I started as a professional journalist at NPR in 2008. I was given a book called Sound Reporting, which was like NPR's official book about how to do reporting.
Mm-hmm.
And in the first pages, there's a line that's something to the effect of the worst accusation that a journalist can be faced with is one of bias. Nothing stings worse. And at the time, I don't even remember reading that. I was young. I was learning. I was taking everything kind of like, okay, this is how you do it. These are the pros.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember that chafing at all. I just took that on. When I look back at that now, really, bias is the worst thing you could do as a journalist. Not getting something totally wrong. You know what I mean? Like accusing somebody of something terrible and it's wrong. That to me would be the worst thing, or one of them, far worse than bias. But this is what was being taught to people who started at NPR. And I just think it's wrong. I think it's not the most important thing. I think there are way more important ways to evaluate news and information and media.
Okay, pop quiz. Have you ever heard of these companies? Shopify, Bayer, Oracle, Indeed, Masterclass, Babbel, Tommy John. We could go on. I don't just host the Media Roundtable podcast, but I have the good fortune of being the CEO of a company called Oxford Road, where we are the world's leading independently owned and operated agency specializing in audio. Think podcasts, radio, and streaming. And what that means is that we get to help great companies worth fighting for, grow with audio advertising, whether it's podcasts, radio, or streaming, and all its various tentacles. This includes media planning and buying. We do analytics, attribution, and insights. We also have a special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. It's our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. Bottom line is we don't just work here. Audio is our passion, and we want to lead this industry to new heights beyond what we've ever seen so far. That's why we've been leading the industry in brand safety and suitability and actually bringing you solutions to market so that you can evaluate the way that you get placed in a show so that it matches up with your values, in addition to avoiding the things that might be problematic for your brand. If you're a chief audio officer and you're looking to get best in market performance at maximum viable scale, do get in touch with us at oxfordroad.com. Or if you love audio and are strategic, relentless, and looking for a career change, consider joining our mission as a fellow agent of influence. Just flip us your resume through oxfordroad.com. And if you're working anywhere in the audio industry and you're serious about this business, make sure you go to oxfordroad.com. Easy to spell. Sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer, at oxfordroad.com. And make sure you mention that you heard about us on the Media Roundtable podcast. Well, so let's talk about that. So we live in this world where we used to think we had some idea of what reporting was supposed to be, and then everybody became a journalist, and then Donald Trump, and then fragmentation and monetization gravitating toward noise rather than volume rather than quality. Where do we go from here? I mean, how does anybody know how to evaluate what's good journalism, and who even would agree on it? Is there even a path here to getting out of the chaos that this is in? And I want to frame this through the lens of, look, this show, we come at it. You come at it through the lens of the journalist. We come at it through the lens of the advertiser, and I just want to talk about that for a second. The advertiser, I think, accepts a level of responsibility today that maybe it didn't in the past, for the type of content that they associate with. They're certainly held accountable for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to fight against this in my career because I've worked in the spoken word medium for about 21 years. And I used to think, put your head down. Like, it's not about what's going on outside of there. We're here to do a job and to sell products and services. I don't think that works anymore. I think that, stakeholder capitalism, the world has shifted a lot in the way it looks at these matters, and brands are now held to account. But how is a brand to decide when a piece of content is worth sponsoring besides their typical commercial objectives? What metrics do they use? What levers can they pull? How do they filter? And what we experienced, and that's why we started doing this show, was in 2020, we saw a lot of advertisers making reactive decisions to what was going on in the world, but
Mm-hmm.
they had no lens, they had no prism, they had no metrics. And so everything was reaction. And I feel like media is sort of that today, is just a bunch of reactions to reactions with no order or place to go, or, forward momentum.
Yeah.
So what the fuck? I mean,
Yeah. I mean, I'm doing this show. I am not presenting this show at the end of a journey at which I have the answers. Like,
right.
question everything is the beginning of a journey in which I'm trying to find the answers in real time.
Are you trying to
Um,
find that answer though? Is that what you're after?
um,
Are you trying to establish standards? And is anybody?
Possibly that might be where we end up. Yeah, I
Okay.
do think, like, I'm interested in at least starting here's some things I know I believe at the beginning of this.
Yeah.
Like, I think that journalists are not great at being introspective. I think part of that comes from the nature of our job. We're always running at the next thing, feeding a
Mm-hmm.
beast.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a lot of time to be introspective.
Mm-hmm.
And our industry's in trouble as well in a lot of ways. So I get it. But I don't think it's doing us any favors. Um, and I think that a certain level of introspection and transparency, and you talked about feedback and actually like taking it on and starting a conversation with each other, with the public, sure, with brands, like, and talking about what we want this to be. There's an opportunity here to build something new out of, if not the ashes, the chaos. And, I think that can only, it's not going to work if it's just like people in an ivory tower making those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think starting from a place of an orientation towards openness and introspection and conversation, and an acknowledgement that there's been a deterioration in the relationship between journalists and everybody else, the public. Like, that's just shown by the data. And I've just started to feel like just doing stories and putting them out into that environment just felt a little crazy. It's like, we need to acknowledge this and like deal with this baseline issue, which is, trust is in the garbage. And what can we do about that? Why is it there? What can be done rather than just accepting it as the only way it has to be?
Let's
So those
talk
are kind
about
of
that for a
the
second.
premises we're
You've seen
starting from. Yeah.
the trust. You probably seen Edelman Trust Barometer, and when you say trust is dead, it's not just journalists; it's all institutions, right?
Yeah.
It's government, it's NGOs, it's education. Basically, pick an institution, and the trust has plummeted in the last half a century, um, and what happens to a society that doesn't trust its institutions? What I wonder is, and I think sometimes I think, well, I work in media, so I'm going to think what I do is most important, right? But
Mhm.
but they say, politics is downstream from culture, right? And they don't trust the politicians, but are they not reacting to cultural phenomenon? And is that something that really it starts in the media, because we create the perceptions of um, what is trustworthy, what is not. And if there could be an increase in trust in journalism, would that potentially flow downstream to more accountability, as journalism is a check on on government institutions. If you trust the police, do you get a better? Do you trust your community a little more? Does that
Yeah, I
start
don't
to
know if it's
impact?
all
Does it
linear,
start up there? Yeah.
I don't know if it's all linear, but I think it's all an ecosystem, and that
Mm-hmm.
I think in a world where people trust journalists more,
Mm-hmm.
journalists are allowed in a more direct way, ideally, to perform their function of, you know, pushing for good government, which could then engender further trust with the public in government. I think
Right.
it's all of a piece. I think it's interesting. I'm just noting that, like, you correctly observed that trust in institutions have gone down. I'll make my pitch, on your show here that
Yeah.
um, there's interesting data that's been coming out to suggest that um, podcasts and podcast hosts specifically are the most trusted figures in media, um, which is interesting because it's
I believe it.
people trust individuals or are tending to trust individuals more than institutions, or there's certainly a current of that happening, and that's for better or worse. I think
Yeah.
that that can be abused, or kind of that responsibility can be handled carelessly. But I also see it as a huge opportunity. It's certainly why I feel really gratified to be operating in this space. That seems like an opportunity. But in general, people trust people, or at least that's what I'm seeing. We're running a story this week on the show that's a hopeful one, actually, that is um basically the story of we're telling the story through a married couple in Southern California, retirees who um were politically divided.
Mm-hmm.
The wife is a self-described bleeding heart liberal.
Mm-hmm.
Husband's a Trump supporter.
Mm-hmm.
And in recent years, they were in quite a bit of turmoil over their news diet. Like, they would sit down in the morning and not agree even on what news to read, never mind what they were taking away from it. And they were fighting a lot. Like, it got really bad. And their names are Dick and Emily. And they kind of, in a funny rom-com scene, went looking for a news source that could bring them back together, um, that they both felt okay about. And they end up finding this newsletter, which is called Tangle, and was founded by a journalist named Isaac Saul. And they both really connected to it. Its whole kind of angle, its whole hook is that it's trying to reach people across the partisan divide, across the political spectrum, and speak to everybody. And they are doing a lot of interesting and very deliberate things to try and do that, and bring people in. And it worked for Dick and Emily. It brought them back together. They have a shared set of facts again that they can at least disagree over, rather than not even believing the same facts. And fascinatingly to me, Dick believed that the came to believe that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, which is not true, but from his sources he came to believe that. And then, after becoming a Tangle reader, Tangle convinced him otherwise. They convinced him to believe the facts, that it was not stolen, which really helped his marriage. And his wife had been trying to convince him of that. She'd been sending him the New York Times and the Atlantic and the Washington Post articles, and he didn't trust them. He didn't believe them. And somehow this newsletter did it. And then our producer, who's reporting this, found another guy reader of Tangle, who believed the 2020 election was stolen, became a reader of Tangle, and
Mm-hmm.
now does not believe it was stolen. So they're
Hmm.
doing something, you know?
Hmm.
Um,
I think
but
it's
a lot of it, when you
important.
hear people talk about it, they talk a lot about Isaac, the founder.
Mm.
Um, it's written very often in his voice. There's a whole section of the newsletter where it's called Isaac's Take. Sometimes it's someone else on staff, but it's a small staff of 5. It's
Mm-hmm.
very much his persona that's coming through in the newsletter, and he's really sharing where he's coming from. Like, there's parts of the newsletter where he strips out all point of view and tries to just the facts, ma'am. But he
Yeah.
includes in there, like, this is what I'm thinking based on the facts I'm seeing, based on the arguments I'm reading across the spectrum. Here's where I'm coming from. And the people that we've spoken to who read this, that's what they appreciate the most. They feels very transparent, and they talk about Isaac. Like, I actually had our producer add in a line recently, just say, like, these readers have not met Isaac. They don't know him, because they're talking about him like they do.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
this parasocial relationship.
Yeah.
So it's very, and they have a podcast too. So, like, it's to me, it kind of proves that point that there's some power there that, if harnessed for good, can really serve good, and improve.
I agree with that completely. Where we get our information from, you know, points us in a lot of different directions. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on the advertiser. Do you think about it, their role in all of this, or do you feel like they're kind of just ancillary? Or do you think that they have a job to do in the kind of
I would
reconstruction to
hope
what we know
that,
as
yeah, brands
journalism?
are supporting information and media sources that are quality. And I guess how would you define that?
And how do
Like,
we know what
yeah,
quality is?
I
So
think that is no, but it's like, are these sources that, I think a lot of the traditional journalistic principles hold true. Some of them are in debate, like objectivity, but are they accountable? Are they transparent? Are they dedicated to factual information? What are the processes they have in place to make sure it is factual? Are they operating in a spirit of like good-heartedness, rather
yeah,
than
yeah,
outrage?
yeah,
Like, I
yeah,
think those are the things I would encourage brands to push for. And innovation, imagination, something that feels on the edge of something rather than that's very important to me too. Like
these are very special
take
marketers
risks.
that
Like,
you.
I would encourage, I think brands have a huge role in like allowing us as creators and journalists to take risks too.
Yeah.
Things aren't going to get fixed if risks aren't taken.
All right, so I'm gonna give
Yeah.
you I'm gonna I'm gonna give you my pitch, and
Okay.
I'd love you to react to it. So first of all, um what I experience is that advertisers generally, if we're just talking in broad strokes here, not about individuals, um, generally they just want to avoid problems. That's job number one. Don't put me in the middle of anything. Don't get me called to the principal's office. Don't let me find out that we're getting beat up on social media because of where we appeared. Right. That's job number one. Job number two is, oh, I like that show. We should be on it. How come I never hear us on that show? That's my favorite. Brian's so cool. Why don't we get on his show? Um,
Hmm.
and then I think at some level, then there's like, okay, well, nothing extreme or no conservative. We get a lot of no conservative dictates, and we
Hmm.
get a lot of no news dictates. And I think the first bucket that I was describing, they end up in the no news pile where they go, we don't care if you're going to use words like Trump, Hamas, whatever, like
Hmm.
we cannot be there, period, which is crazy to think that we live in a free society that is dependent on information that's made publicly available through ad supported journalism. But the ad supported journalism has to pull towards the extreme because it has to get monetized. Uh, and the people that
Yeah.
monetize it don't actually want to touch the most important parts, right? So this is the world we live in. So we started doing this show 4 years ago and asking everyone, what do we do? What do we do? And so, but first conclusion that I think we came to is that media needs nutrition labels. Advertisers
Hmm.
need to have some sort of designation that helps them make sense of what they're viewing. The challenge is the early adopters of applying labels to media are all horribly biased.
Mm.
And there's usually a commercial interest. There's if there's not a commercial interest, there's a political interest, and a lot of times that's also a commercial interest. And so you get
Is that true? I know
reactiveness.
about a couple places. Isn't like NewsGuard, like Stephen Brill's place? Have you heard of this place? Like,
Sure, I know NewsGuard
yeah.
absolutely, and I've seen their reports. And
What do you think of that? Does
I
that
think I think
label
you
the
have
way you're talking about? You're imagining something different.
two individuals doing a book report on the entirety of your work and giving you a grade that is based on their metrics. I've not seen a lot of consistency or reliability or scalability in that model, although I
Yeah.
think we're all trying to row in the same direction here. There's a lot of people trying to do a lot of good work. We made investments. We had Ad Fontes Media, who does the media bias chart, on the show back in 2020, and
Hmm.
we partnered with them to launch the media bias chart for podcasts. I think there's some good data on that chart. And
Yeah.
that has humans right, left, and center having to come to an agreement on the
But it's still
reliability and the
bias. Like,
bias.
why is bias? Like, is it like,
Well, you got three hands on the Ouija board, and so you got
yeah.
everybody gets there's some representation on there, and there's some give and take. There is some tension, so that it
Yeah.
isn't just one person making the call based on their
Mhm.
ideology. And I think net that gives you something that is certainly an improvement on what you have today. We've worked with, we went deep on GARM. We tried to use, do you know the GARM framework for safety and suitability? So
No.
Global Advertisers for Responsible Media came out of the World Federation of Advertisers. You would notice that there were just congressional hearings with Ben Shapiro and CEOs of big brands called the Congress, and Jim Jordan's,
Mhm.
lecturing them. And then Elon, or then X sued them last month, and they shut the whole thing down. But this was the framework the industry was using to say, what is brand safe? And let's look at violence levels, spam, terrorism, sexually explicit content, socially sensitive debated issues. So it's like we were asking people and machines to do a lot to evaluate content on all these criteria in a reliable and predictable way, and for brands to try to set their own tolerance levels on things that are very abstract. So it wasn't actually practical. So it got shut down under the guise of political bias. I don't think it was political bias. I think it was just totally impractical.
I see.
So here's where we're at today. I think there's one metric that solves most of this, and then you got a few other metrics that you could use. And I don't think it's about trying to get people to agree on what's misinformation, right? Because I think that's a non-starter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, is personal attack. There is a correlation between personal attack and political extremism. There is a correlation between personal attack and misinformation. The difference
Whether
is
whether a media source tends to do personal attacks.
there's a clear correlation. Yeah.
Huh.
And so if you can measure personal attack, you kind of get the whole thing. And furthermore, if you think about it, what is a brand actually concerned about? They're concerned that I talk about what a jerk that person is, and then that person responds and
Mm-hmm.
throws a rock at me, and the brand's in the middle. But you know what? If I don't throw any rocks, nobody's probably going to throw a rock back at me and hit the advertiser in the head, which is what happens. So I'm like, so much of this notion of brand safety and suitability that's driving the conversation is fear-based because of political polarization, and people don't want to get sucked into the
Yeah, I was
culture
going to say, is
wars.
that really? I mean, it's
Yes,
if that's true that everybody's
this is a
operating out of a crouch of fear rather
that's
than
all it
you know,
is. That's all it is.
a
That's
posture
all
of
it is.
empowerment. Yeah.
Right. Well, we polish it as best we can, but let's be honest. Why are we doing this? Because we have a culture war, and people don't, and brands don't want to get their time and objectives thwarted by getting stuck in the middle of that. So if you deal with the personal attack component, it de-escalates, and actually turns out the media, you can have more conversation.
What
And
data? I mean, it's that's compelling, and I believe it, but I'm just curious where the data comes from, or what.
how do I draw the correlation?
Yeah.
Well, okay, so one fundamental assumption you would have to feel good about is the general gist of the media bias chart. And
Mhm.
so you'd have to go on there, look at how it spreads, look at the shape. It goes from high, middle to low, extreme. And if you're doing that based on so the more extreme, the typically lower you are on reliability, and reliability is made up of things like personal attack, presenting, all the facts around an issue, presenting two sides of an argument, things like that.
Mhm.
And so you actually see an abundance of correlated instances where the higher you are on the Y, the closer you are on the X, and the farther you are on the X, the lower you are on the Y. It's not true without exception,
Mhm.
but I think that the macro, you look at the pattern, you go,
But
okay,
so you're
there's a
inferring this from other stuff. There haven't been direct studies of personal attack correlates with other bad qualities of information from the same source.
um so I put a lot of credibility into the work being done by Ad Fontes, but I think that it definitely tracks with everything else I've seen. I mean, I've been doing a
Mm.
lot on this for a long time, and I think
Yeah.
it tracks. But test it. Let's find a
No,
way
it's
to
that's
test
why
it.
I'm asking. I'm like, maybe
Yeah.
this is a story for us.
But
It's interesting. Yeah.
where I'm at on all this is I'm like, look, advertisers, they don't want this burden, but they have the burden, and they can actually serve as a bit of a fifth estate here, as a check on the fourth estate, as the fourth estate is a check on everything else. And they're not necessarily best equipped to do that, but I think that they can be equipped with some simple kind of golden rule metrics that help us reframe and simplify the way we think about what type of content is and is not worth sponsoring. And I think we all agree there's been enough attack. There's been enough correlation of evil and disagreement. And if we can kind of lower the judgment on it and facilitate conversation and make it more profitable for creators to have a conversation that actually explores and does things like what podcasting is good at, to do this,
Yeah.
we can actually hear each other and go, I'm not sure I agree with that, but let's explore, And I think that's what it's all about. And so to me, that's job number one. If you want to measure profanity because your brand is, catering to children or whatever, more sensitive communities, fine. You can measure that. The tech can tell you how many swear words are in a show, but that's not that hard to do. And frankly, I don't think that's why we're even talking about it. So
yeah,
that's,
so I've been weighing in my head just like in our reporting, like how can we figure this out, or even just as an entrepreneur myself, like how can we marshal technology to try and surface information that has the qualities we want, versus not.
And I think it starts
not to
with
censor
civility.
things, but to to label them in certain ways. But if there's like like you're saying, if there's like one quality that serves as a marker for a lot of other stuff, that's certainly interesting. Yeah.
It's the golden rule.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, let's start there. Don't, treat people the way you want to be treated. And that doesn't mean
is this a good actor or bad actor kind of?
Let's just, if you start with that, I think you cut out 90+% of the nonsense. And we don't have
ruled
to
out if there was some kind of like way of,
Sure. Well, so fine. So you're not going to spend a lot of money with Dan Bongino if you want to see high levels of civility in the content. You're not going to be big on Michael Savage. And, frankly, when you go up the chain and you start to see, Shapiro's not great on there. And neither are Pod Save America. Those guys, they throw their elbows. The Midas Touch Network, who, these are friends, these people I'm talking about on both sides. We work with everybody, but but they're not civil all the time, and they make their arguments by taking somebody else down. And so I say to them, like, guys, love you. I support free speech. I want you to have the right to say what you want where you want to say it, but that doesn't mean you have to get paid extra for it. And in fact, you're going to get paid. We're going to tax you if you're going to keep making it hard for us to advocate for you, because it's not actually helping. And just from a social impact standpoint, I don't think it's good for people. So, and usually they're kind of like a little mad about it, but they understand, at least it's fair, because here's what happened. Here's the shitty thing. Here's how this thing all goes sideways, is that because we're in such a reactive place right now, what people have done is they've started picking topics and going, are you talking about that topic? If so, we can't be friends. Or they say, are you talking about that topic? I hope we agree on what you conclude on that topic. And they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I'm like, this is not working. And I'm not waiting for everybody to start agreeing on topics. Let's find something we can work with here. And so that's
an approach to discourse, or an approach to storytelling, which can cover anything if done right.
So it's been a big passion project for me. But also I think there's a big commercial need and opportunity, for all of our businesses. And I think we want to make responsible conversation really lucrative.
Amen. That's awesome.
So here we are. So that's where we're at. So hopefully we can be friends and, help each other on this journey, because I think, your show is in a different class of content that we really want to be, it's not our job to push advertisers on things that don't make sense for them, but we do want to showcase where good work is being done and hope that gives a little extra consideration. And I think, the work that you're doing should be known, because you've done something that is constructive and useful and brave and timely. And we all want to be advocates for that. And that's what we're about at this company and on this program. So I'm glad we're talking. And
I really appreciate that,
what
Dan.
you do.
No, and I appreciate you've given me stuff to think about as well. I might follow up about some of it. And in the meantime, I'm just going to start attacking my enemies on the podcast. So
I'll show you what happens to your civility score. I'll shoot you a note.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it changes from episode to episode, so it'll be interesting. Anyway, this has been great, and
it's
thanks
been a pleasure.
for
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, that was fun. If you are a chief audio officer, as we know many of you are, please give some extra consideration to Question Everything with Brian Reed. He's obviously doing some very important work, and we're glad to introduce what he's about to this audience. So, and thank you for taking the time today and joining the Media Roundtable. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and to use your influence for good. And as we say every week, as members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but also edify, and to build bridges across differences while preserving fair-minded discussion around the most important topics of our age. If you're a marketer and you're looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. It's free. And if you have any feedback for us, you want to tell us any feedback, good, bad, or otherwise, info@mediaroundtable.com. Don't forget to check out our creative focused show, Ad Infinitum, led by Stu Redwine. And finally, if you're a chief audio officer looking to get best in market performance at maximum viable scale and to balance your business objectives with your brand values, reach out to Oxford Road. And finally, I just want to say thank you to everybody that helped make this possible. And I'm thinking about Haley, Bianca, Kyle, Ezra, Mary Jane, Everett, Neil, the team of Sharp Pen Media at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.